Hello, my name is Chad Marlowe, and I'm an Advocacy and Policy Counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union. As part of my job at the ACLU, I oversee the nationwide community control over police surveillance effort, which we sometimes refer to by the acronym COPS. I'm really delighted to be able to speak to all of you tonight about the effort in St. Louis to bring a COPS law to your city. Now, what exactly is the COPS effort? The COPS effort is a municipal-level legislative effort to change how decisions are made regarding the funding, acquisition, and use of surveillance technologies in your city. Now, currently, most cities in the country, including St. Louis, allow police departments to make decisions in secret about what surveillance technologies they are going to acquire and about how they are going to use those surveillance technologies in your city. COPS is looking to change that. They're looking to have your elected representatives, the aldermen who represent you before your city council, be the ones who make the decisions about whether surveillance technology should be funded, acquired, or used by law enforcement in the city of St. Louis. Most importantly, by requiring certain information about the technologies and how they are going to be used be released publicly in advance of those hearings, the process is designed to empower you, the public, to be able to develop a really educated opinion about what's being proposed for the surveillance technologies, and to be able to fully participate in the public decision-making process, which will hopefully maximize your influence over whether or not surveillance technologies are used in your city at all, and to the extent that they are, how they are appropriately used. So in that respect, the COPS effort isn't just about surveillance technology, but it's also about good government and government transparency and decision-making that affects the public. Before going any further, of course, I would like to specifically thank Alderman Terry Kennedy for stepping up and introducing St. Louis's COPS bill. You know, it always takes one person to be the first person to stand up and start a movement, and we really appreciate Alderman Kennedy's role in advancing this effort in your city. Now, before taking kind of a deeper dive into why COPS is so important in St. Louis and throughout our country, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about some of the surveillance technologies that are being used right now to monitor the public. Now, I realize that some of these are going to seem like the stuff of science fiction, but I assure you they are science fact. Whether or not they're actually being used in St. Louis at this moment, to be honest, we don't know because of the veil of secrecy that's dropped down over the use of these technologies, which is why we need COPS in the first place. But I can absolutely guarantee you that every one of these technologies are being used by at least some police departments on the local level in the country. The first is cell site simulators, which sometimes go by the trade name stingrays or hailstorms. What cell site simulators are is they are devices that actually mimic a real cell phone tower. It basically tricks your phone into thinking it needs to communicate with this tower, with this fake tower, in order for you to get cell phone service, in order for you to be able to communicate. So it kind of works like the children's game of Marco Polo. The Stingray device shouts out Marco, and your phone has no choice but to shout back Polo, because that's how cell phones communicate with cell phone towers. But when your cell phone shouts back Polo, what it actually does is it tells the Stingray device who you are and where you are, and actually gives the device the ability to pull data off your phone that will allow it to actually read communications that you're having at the time. So if you're sending text messages or you're sending an email. So in essence, a Stingray enables local law enforcement to turn your cell phone into a tracking device that many of us, myself included, carry with us everywhere we go. The next technology are called automatic license plate readers, or ALPRs for short. What those are devices that scan the license plate on every car, digitize it, and then communicate it back so they can track what cars have actually traveled in front of certain automatic license plate readers. Now, in certain circumstances, they can have actually very good purposes. For example, they can be used to collect tolls at bridges and tunnels, and that can be very good for the environment by moving traffic along. They can also be used to spot cars that are involved in Amber Alerts, child kidnapping situations, and that's very valuable. But they can also be dangerous as well. If they are used broadly and the data from them is captured, they can enable local police departments to track where every single person has traveled within a city in their car, including places they visited, like a doctor's office or a political meeting. And these are the sort of information that I think many of us wouldn't feel comfortable with the government kind of creating a broad dossier on everywhere we've traveled in a city, including, incidentally, where we choose to sleep at night. Another technology which is broadly used are closed-circuit television cameras, which can be placed throughout a city to be able to monitor people in public. But when those technologies are married with facial recognition software, which is becoming more and more advanced almost on a yearly basis, it can actually be used not only to look broadly at the public, but say, there's John Doe. We've identified him. Now we're going to track where John Doe travels in public and perhaps keep a record of where you're traveling in public. Another device is called ShotSpotter. Now, ShotSpotter is an interesting technology. By placing what essentially are microphones throughout particular communities, when a shot from a gun is fired, ShotSpotter is able to triangulate where the sound comes from and alert police that there has been a shot fired in a neighborhood. Now, that can be a pretty valuable technology in communities. However, ShotSpotters, because they are microphones, could be used to just flip on the microphones and listen to what's going on in any particular neighborhood or community or on a block. So that's why it's important, if this technology is going to be used, that we understand what it is going to be used for, to isolate gunshots, and what it cannot be used for, to just randomly eavesdrop on conversations going on your block. Another technology is called an X-ray van. And what that does is it essentially puts in technology like you see in airports for scanning your luggage when you go through screening at the TSA counter, only it's much, much stronger. So it enables a van to literally go by and peer through the walls of cars as it goes by. Look through the door, look into your trunk. Now, that's not only intrusive, but it's also problematic from a health standpoint, because the radiation that comes out of these devices is so strong, it actually can be a health hazard to those who are walking by it as it goes by on the street. So, are these devices being used in your technology? What are the public health impacts of them being used? This is something the public should actually have a role in being able to discuss and debate. Another technology which is coming on board more and more are what are called surveillance-enabled light bulbs. Now, these light bulbs, which are actually LED bulbs, so they're very energy efficient, at first blush can make a lot of sense. People come along and they say, hey, if your city replaces the incandescent light bulbs it's currently using in its streetlights with LED bulbs, you can save a lot of money. And that's certainly true. But then they mention that these light bulbs also either do contain or can be easily adjusted to contain small cameras and microphones in every light bulb. So imagine, if you will, for a moment, that every streetlight in St. Louis, by virtue of having this new surveillance-enabled light bulb put into it, has turned itself not only into a streetlight, but also into a video camera and an audio device to record sounds that are going by. Is that something that you'd want in the city of St. Louis? Well, only if the COPS bill passes will you have a chance to even know it's being considered and to participate in a public discussion of whether that's right for your city. Another technology which has been used and has been tested out in places like Baltimore and was recently considered, but thanks to a public discussion rejected in Miami, Florida, is airborne wide-angle high-definition cameras. And what these are is these are cameras with an amazing level of high-definition technology and a broad lens, so they are actually from the sky, either in a drone or in a piloted vehicle, able to monitor and record the comings and goings of people in an entire city. So now it doesn't have the technology to actually be able to read faces, but it can monitor that a person comes out of a particular home, which may be your home, gets into a car. It can then follow that car, see where that car goes, see where that car stops, and literally follow every single person in an entire city. They can, retain the video from these devices, and then anytime they want, they can go back and decide to see, hey, where did you go? Where did your neighbor go? Where did your brother and sister go? Is that right for St. Louis? The only way you would get to have input is if a COPS bill, like the one proposed by Alderman Kennedy, is adopted. A final technology which is becoming more and more broadly used and which can have positive benefits if used in the right way and negative benefits in used in the wrong way is police body cameras. A lot of time these cameras are being rolled out in order to promote greater transparency and accountability with police forces, but they can also be broadly used as surveillance devices. And so in order to be able to have a conversation about the way the police body cameras are rolled out and what are and are not appropriate uses is to pass a COPS type bill in St. Louis, which will guarantee that your elected representatives and you have a place in the conversations about how that technology is used. Now, let's get down to 3 of the most critical reasons why COPS bills are being considered in cities across the nation. The first is issues involving privacy. The next is issues involving civil rights. And the third is issues with respect to Donald Trump using surveillance technologies on the local level to pursue his unlawful and unconstitutional objectives. So let's kind of talk about those one at a time. With respect to privacy issues, that's basically kind of the first reaction you get to surveillance technology. Do we want to live in a city? Do we want St. Louis to be a city where everyone in public is monitored like they were a criminal suspect? That you, when you decide to have communications or travel from point A to point B, you are literally watched in a way that a decade or 2 ago would have been impossible unless a police officer was actually tailing you on the street and in your car. But nowadays it can be done in a very broad mass surveillance context. Is every citizen of the city of St. Louis someone who should be treated and monitored like they were a criminal suspect? I'll give you an example of that. Using some of the devices that we just talked about, cell site simulators, social media monitoring software, which I didn't talk about, which gives police the ability to monitor things that are being said online and social media, which again can be good, but if they're monitoring things that they don't particularly like we've seen, there was a police that used this technology to monitor the hashtag Black Lives Matter, it can be used for pretty bad purposes, so you'd probably want to know about that. So cell site simulators, social media monitoring software, and automatic license plate readers, they can create a pretty good record of where you go, where you travel, the places you visit, like houses of worship, doctor's offices, political meetings, and create a dossier on you using these technologies. That is pretty invasive when it comes to individual people's privacy, particularly when they have done absolutely nothing wrong. That is a level of privacy intrusion that you may not like in St. Louis. Your elected officials may not like. Again, what the COPS bill does is it gives you a meaningful opportunity to participate in a discussion about whether that is right for you and for your community. So the first reason that we talk about passing COPS laws is to protect the privacy of the people in the city where they're being considered. Now, the second issue, which is critically important, is civil rights. Now, why is the use of surveillance technology a civil rights issue? And it is a civil rights issue because although these surveillance technologies are used to broadly watch the public, they are, quite frankly, used to surveil certain communities far more than others, and in particular, communities of color. Now, why do we know this? Because when we have had the rare opportunity to peer beyond the veil of secrecy that is dropped over police use of these surveillance technology at the local level, we've consistently found that they are overwhelmingly deployed in communities of color. And to give you an example of some of the cities where we've seen this, we've seen it in Milwaukee, we've seen it in Baltimore, we've seen it in Tallahassee, we've seen it in Oakland, California, and we've seen it in Lansing, Michigan. So the idea that these surveillance technologies are used, to surveil and keep you safe from the bad guys or from terrorists or whatever other things are used to explain their use, it's not that they aren't used for those things. They are used for those things. But they're used for other things far more. And that is really generally to keep an eye on communities of color. And again, this is something that I think offends many of our basic commitments to civil rights principles, that the police should not use surveillance technologies to keep a watchful eye on certain communities, just waiting for an excuse to intervene in those communities, while other communities have no such level of oversight. That is something that we only get to discuss. We only get to understand if there is a public disclosure process in which you are engaged. And it is certainly a reasonable thing to ask when police are proposing using surveillance technologies. what are your policies going to be about how you use them? Are you going to deploy them against certain communities more than others? And on what basis are you going to deploy them? You only get to have that conversation if you have a COPS law in place. So the second major reason why COPS laws are so critically important is to not just uphold civil liberties like privacy, but to defend and protect civil rights from the disproportionate and discriminated deployment of these surveillance technologies. The third important reason why we really need to be looking into how these surveillance technologies used is, frankly, their context now that Donald Trump is the president of the United States. Now, when Donald Trump ran for president, he said a couple of things. He said things like, I am going to focus my efforts on identifying and deporting millions of undocumented immigrants, on tracking and surveilling Muslims, and on preventing them from even coming to this country in the first place, and on kind of doubling down on aggressive tactics for policing communities of color. Now, you can say a lot of things about Donald Trump, but at least with regard to this, he has been a man of his word, because that is exactly what he's done now that he's elected. Now, in order to achieve those goals, he's really targeting millions of people, tens of thousands of people in St. Louis alone. He is going to need the help of local police departments in order to pursue that agenda. But quite frankly, a lot of police departments are not really that anxious to help him, either because they fundamentally disagree with his objectives, or because they just don't want to reallocate resources that, say, they're using to try to prevent murders and thefts and those sort of things from occurring towards trying to track immigrants and Muslims. But even in police departments that are resistant, that would say to you, we will not help in these efforts, they still may be passively helping these efforts because of what they do with the surveillance data once it's collected and who they choose to share it with. They may be passively helping President Trump pursue his agenda and target vulnerable communities in your city simply because they are either directly or indirectly sharing the surveillance data they collect with the federal government. Now, how do they do that? There's really one of two ways. The first is the federal government, and this is a program that began under the Obama administration, spends tens of millions of dollars every year providing grants to local police departments so they can purchase surveillance technologies. But here's the rub. In those agreements, they include things like non-disclosure agreements. You can't talk about the grant you're being given and what you're buying, as well as requirements that as part of the federal government buying the surveillance technology, the local government has to share their surveillance data with the federal government in return. This may even include real-time access to technologies like closed-circuit television cameras. So that is one way. Has the police department in St. Louis accepted grants from the federal government in return for agreeing to share their surveillance technology? You don't know, because they get to make those agreements in secret under the current law. COPS law, proposed by Alderman Kennedy, would change that. There's another way that the data can be shared as well, which is the police departments can just have, by their policy, agreements to share surveillance data with other agencies, like Missouri state level law enforcement agencies may gather that information, and that may just be, of course, that they share it with state agencies. Or they may share it with regional fusion centers, which gather surveillance data from a wide variety of sources and then make that available to other law enforcement agencies, including federal agencies like ICE and the Department of Justice. And so either by an agreement to share it directly with the federal government or by agreements to share it with other sources that then can share that agreement with the federal government, the St. Louis police are making the surveillance data they collect using surveillance technologies in your communities available to the Trump administration. Now, that may be something that you are perfectly fine with, or that may be something you find highly objectionable. But regardless, you don't even get to debate that, because currently those data sharing agreements, like the acquisition and use of the surveillance technologies themselves, are made in secret by your police department. The COPS bill would change that. Now, in case that seems like something that's a complete hypothetical, we know it's not. In Oakland, California, which has declared itself to be a sanctuary city, so it is openly said, we are not going to help the Trump administration in its effort to track and deport immigrants, their privacy commission, their city has a privacy commission, they recently uncovered evidence that the U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Agency, often referred to as ICE, has been accessing automatic license plate reader data collected by the Oakland Police Department and using it to go after immigrants. So even though Oakland has said we are a surveillance city, we are a sanctuary city, and that our police will not use surveillance technologies and other efforts to enable Trump to go after our immigrant community, they have been inadvertently helping out the Trump administration and ICE anyway, because their ALPR data was shared with the Fusion Center that is now being accessed by ICE, by the Trump administration, to go after vulnerable communities in Oakland, California. That may be something that you do not want happening in St. Louis, but in order to be able to stop it, you have to pass your COPS law. Now, a warning. Although we have found pretty broad support for COPS laws on the political left and political right, we do end up getting pushback from police forces who, quite frankly, and perhaps understandably, like the ability to make these decisions completely by themselves and in secret. It's kind of funny if you think about it. The local police don't seem to have any problem using surveillance technologies to monitor the public, but for some reason they have a real problem with the public monitoring their use of surveillance technologies. Ironic, to say the least. So the bottom line is there are lots of very critical reasons why you should want a COPS law in the city of St. Louis. But in order to have that happen, it's time to support the efforts of all the local organizations who have made it happen up to this point, and to support the efforts of Alderman Kennedy. Now, how can you do that? There's many ways you can do it. I'm sure that will be discussed at length tonight, but certainly you can start by talking to your own alderman about co-sponsoring Alderman Kennedy's bill. You can write a letter to the editor of your local paper and discuss why you think this is important for your community and your city. But the bottom line is everything you do matters and can make a difference here. And so I want to, in conclusion, thank you for your interest in this issue and for getting involved in trying to support the effort to bring a COPS law to the city of St. Louis. We are here, the ACLU is here. Many, many local organizations are standing by, ready to help in this effort, and I wish you the very, very best of luck in getting a COPS law for the city of St. Louis. Thank you very much.